We get a lot of questions at Southern and as I go around about moral influence theory of atonement and what's going on in Adventism. As a young pastor, I ran into this at camp meeting in Greater New York Conference when they brought in Dick Wynn. And his books, if God won the war, why isn't it over, et cetera, et cetera. And I got some rich blessings and correctives for my spiritual life out of this approach. And as I dug and studied and went further and so forth and so on, I found some real blessings in it. But then I also began to discover some inadequacies for my spiritual life and inadequacies in my ministry and evangelistic outreach. I had ministry needs that the Dick Wynn type approach, which I later discovered is very close to Graham Maxwell, to me was inadequate to address and handle. Some good stuff, but some problems. This mix, okay? And so I had to do some rethinking, and then I never really was facing it directly, so I kind of left it behind. But as I've come out of seminary and doctoral studies, back to ministry in the Atlantic Union and now teaching at Southern, it keeps coming up in stronger and stronger questions. And so there's a point where the elephant's in the room that we need to do some examination of the elephant. Now, a second point is, particularly one of the key characters in this question and controversy is from the Collegedale area. And I began to get many questions about Dr. Tim Jennings. And I would be in the cafeteria with students, and they start asking me questions. I haven't really read him. I haven't, talked with him. But if what you're saying is true, it sounds kind of like this to me. But, I was very couchy and cagey, And then at one point, I got an email from a colleague. Tim Jennings is unhappy with you. You're not following Matthew 18. If you have an offense with Tim Jennings, go see Tim yourself. And I emailed back and said, I have no offense with Tim Jennings. I am responding to public discussion and public publications and public internet sites. And when you put yourself out in the public, it's fair game to publicly analyze. And when I put myself in the public as a teacher, and when I send a paper, do a paper at ETS or ATS, I get public scrutiny. Welcome to the club. Okay? So I want to make it clear today that guys like Tim Jennings and Graham Maxwell, I have no personal offense. Some of their concepts have blessed my life, but there are things out there in public, and so I'm taking on some questions in public, some of the inadequacies for me, and why I think there's some issues here. But I want to make it clear that there's no personal vendetta. By the way, after that exchange, this colleague arranged a meeting with Tim and I. I never did meet Dr. Maxwell. He managed to die before I had the resources to be where we could encounter each other. But Tim and I got together one evening, and 4+ hours later, we finally got done. And so we had a pretty long, very heavy, serious discussion with each other, agreed that we had a number of key things in common, agreed that we still had some unresolved differences of opinion, and I believe agreed to continue respecting each other. So that's where I understand us to be at a personal level, this way. I'll only quip that out of that 4 hours, I think I managed to get about 45 minutes of speaking in. He's very enthusiastic about his views, and sometimes it's hard to get a word in edgewise. So that's just my general experience. What I'm doing today is going to be a mix, because I see very strong similarities between Graham Maxwell and Tim Jennings. So I'm blending a number of things, and I'm simplifying because Part of why I'm up to 1 in the morning is there's just so much. How do I boil this down to a short? I could spend a whole week on this, kind of a thing. So with that in mind, I want to go back to some history, because the joke is the one thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. History of atonement theories. As we come out of the early church into the post-apostolic era, now even John has died, there's no more living apostles, almost no one now alive who would have known Jesus or even known an apostle. So kind of like how we basically have no one now who knew Ellen White, similar kind of a thing. The question came up because in the Bible, Jesus says that he gave his life as a ransom for many. Well, a ransom is some kind of payment to release someone, right? So if Jesus gave his life as a ransom, to whom was the ransom given? And the initial theory was that it was a ransom paid to the devil to free us from his clutches. So we have the ransom to the devil theory. This is early 2nd century, 125, 150, and so forth and so on. All the way up into Augustine is influenced by this one. And a great example of this is the birdcage story that we used to see floating around the internet about the little boy who had a bird in a cage that he wanted to molest and harm, and a minister on the way to his Sunday service sees the boy with the bird, and he buys the bird and the bird cage from the boy, takes it to church and says, this is what Jesus, he bought us back, and he opens the door so we can fly free. He's paying off the ransom to the devil. The boy acting like the devil. Obvious problem, though, is that it seems to give too much significance and power to the devil. And so they started to recognize this, and so along came Anselm, and he says, no, the ransom is not paid to the devil, it is paid to satisfy God's wounded honor. Our sin offends God's honor, it dishonors God, it insults God, and so God's honor needs to be satisfied with a ransom to assuage this wound in the honor. And it's out of this that we get the angry father, loving son caricature that tortured Martin Luther. Okay? Because God is the offended, I've been shamed. It's a shame-honor kind of dynamic. And so I've been shamed, and it needs to be unshamed, And so yes, Anselms tended to have a much more vengeful God. It's a bit of a caricature, but it's understandable how at the lay level, angry father, loving son kind of containing, and the ransom affects God's emotional life, basically. Well, obviously, I think we can see problems with that. And so we get the inevitable contemporary backlash in Peter Abelard with the moral influence theory, which I will come back to in a moment. But basically, in short, Abelard says the ransom is more of a metaphor, and nothing gets paid off because God already loves you and there's nothing to fix in God. Okay. Moral influence, however, was rejected by the mainline body of Christ because of its inadequacies, etc. So they pretty much were running on Anselm until we get to the Reformation, and particularly Luther is kind of the fulcrum in my mind. But the Reformers modify penal substitution. Now, penal means, in others, legal, judicial penalty, crime punishment kind of a thing. And so we have what I call penal substitution 2, which is very much in Ellen White's writings. The penalty is not paid to satisfy an offended God, the penalty is paid to satisfy the violation of law. It's a criminal. Okay? And so you break the law, there's some kind of punishment, because if we don't punish for violated law, we lose our ability to govern. And so their concern is that God, if God does not punish sin, it enables sin. And Ellen White has some comments to that effect and so forth, which we'll come back to later. And therefore, it's more of a professional role as governor that God has to govern. And so while he has these personal feelings, I love my people and so forth and so on, but I got to do my job as boss and keep order and so forth. And when somebody harms someone else, there's an accountability process, I have to get into and so forth, okay? It's kind of like being a parent. I love my kids, but there are times I got to play governor, right? Okay? And if my son's abusing my daughter and I don't govern and intervene, she's not going to think I'm a very loving father, And so this allowed them to have a loving God, because remember, Luther moves from penal 1 to penal 2. And Luther loves the love of God, and yet he very much sees God as having a law to which we are held accountable. However, the danger of penal 2 is that it easily falls into a rote, obey and live, disobey and die legalistic mentality. Around this late Reformation time, Hugo Grotius comes along. He goes by 2 or 3 names. This is the one I remember. And he comes up with governmental theory of atonement. And Hugo went a little too far reacting to the penals, but not as bad as Anselm. And there's a lot of good here. And what happens is that about 100, 150 years later, Methodism picks up on governmental theory, but it modifies it. And Ellen White comes out of this Methodism that is saturated with a modified governmental theory. And there are some of her concepts that very much fit into this. And so the later version is they love to use Darius to illustrate. Darius loves Daniel. But if Darius doesn't address Daniel's violation of the law, he loses his kingdom. People won't take him seriously. And so even though he loves Daniel, he's got to deal with the transgression in order to maintain the larger social order and not have anarchy and chaos. And you remember how Darius spent all day and all night trying to find a loophole in the law to deliver Daniel, right? And he can't do it. Now the weakness of this is that Darius was subject to a law higher than himself, right? The law of the Medes and the Persians. And I don't believe God is subject to a law higher than himself. Okay? Or else we wouldn't need God, we'd just need that law. But this part of the illustration works well. So when Darius puts Daniel in the lion's den, he is not acting in the capacity of the loving friend, he's acting in the capacity of the king. And the good news is that our God saw Adam and Eve sin against his commandment and against his government and rebel against him, but he knew they were deceived into it, and in his great love for Adam and Eve, he says, I want to find a way to deliver them, but I can't do it in a way that undermines the safety of the universe and ability to rule. And God's solution was an option not available to Darius at a realistic level. He says, I'll go into the lion's den in Adam's place. And I'll defeat the lion and I'll come back out. Darius couldn't go in and defeat the lion. Okay. So governmental theory, I think, has some, because it separates between God's private emotional life and his need to play a public role as governor. Much the way the mayor of a city, if his son joins a gang and the gang is, killing people and having a hostage situation, he may, as mayor, have to make a decision about his son's, shoot-to-kill order for the safety. He has to act as mayor, not just as father. With that in mind, the core characteristics of Anselm was opposing, Abelard was opposing Anselm's satisfaction model. And according to the encyclopedias and articles, all this, I've read many of them, Abelard viewed the penal statements about God's punishment and destruction of sinners and so forth in the Bible, the lake of fire and so forth. He saw the Bible as a mix of fallible man and infallible God, and all these parts about punishment and retribution were from the fallible man, and all the stuff about love and grace is basically the inspired part from God. Now, a few years ago, at meetings, a West Coast professor flatly argued the same thing, that the sacrificial system starting in Genesis was not instituted by God. This was a human invention to barter with God because we don't understand him. Very Abelard. Very Abelard. So the human authors were mistaken about writing about propitiation and man having legal problems with God. The penal elements are not biblical inspired. It's the loving elements because God is love. That's his essential nature. So what happens then in theology, we like to divide the atonement into two parts, objective and subjective. Objective involves what it does towards God, and this focuses on the legal issues. Criminal, acquittal, justification, etc., all legal terminology. Subjective is what it does for me. Fixing my view of God, I get the joy of salvation, transformation of my life, right relationship with God. This is how it affects me. Abelard basically rejects this. He said there's nothing in God that needs affecting by the atonement. He already loves you. There's nothing that needs altering in God. The whole problem is on our side, and so the atonement is about God fixing us. There's nothing that needs fixing over here. So God is not offended with man. Nothing in God needs satisfying or changing. No legal problems. The problem is in our attitudes, which separate us from God. We fear God's justice and punishment because God has been misrepresented by fallible Bible authors. God's essential nature is love. Notice the Hellenistic, where the essential nature is the ground of reality. So if God is loving, he's wired this way, he must act this way, and there's a certain deterministic quality to it. And thus, issues like justice and holiness are minimized to near denial. And I've already so basically, God is wired to be warm and friendly and little else. So Christ thus dies not to pay a penalty, but to morally influence us about how much God loves us by revealing God's great love in dying on the cross. So that the difficulty is only in us, never towards God. God is freely willing to forgive without any satisfaction being made. Which first of all seems like amnesty, not forgiveness. And secondly, if God has no problem, why would there be a need to forgive? To me, this cheapens our concept of forgiveness. Sin seems to be only ignorance and fear and not an actual violation of law or person. So salvation becomes a subjective change of mind and attitude toward God, not a deliverance from criminal penalty and so forth and so on. Now, the advantages of moral influence, there is truth to it. It's very good at showing the gracious side of God and that he's not hostile towards sinners. And I think that's an important corrective in some circles, is it not? Okay? And so, yes, it's very good. It's very good at emphasizing the relational side of God. And again, I think that's very, very important. And I think one of the problems in Adventism today, it reminds me of second-generation Lutheranism, we've gotten so doctrinaire that no one has a relationship with Christ anymore. And that's the way we have all these problems, by the way. fix the relationship with Christ and the connection to the head, and it will solve many problems. Okay? And it recognizes that there is a moral influence element to the atonement that the penal-only view tends to give lip service to, but a little weak on, right? Okay. So I agree, there's some good stuff here. Now again, I've already dumped my cover here that I'm talking especially about these two guys. And you notice the asterisk here. I'm going to be very honest. Both of them claim they are not moral influence. Maxwell says, Abelard had no great controversy. I have great controversy. This is not moral influence. Jennings says, I believe in an objective element. Maxwell doesn't. So Jennings will say, at least to me in the 4 hours, he said Maxwell is moral influence. But then Jennings says, I'm not moral influence, I'm healing substitution model. And on his website, he's very adamant, I'm not moral influence, I believe this objective. Problem was, over a 4-hour conversation, he could never adequately define what the objective was. I'll come back to it in a moment. But I want to make it clear, I want to be honest with the data, these guys don't think they're moral influence. Okay? And now I'm going to pull professional rank. Because Jennings is a medical doctor, and this is the great Adventist traditions of medical doctors playing theologian. Okay? And we also have a great tradition in Western America of going to Dr. Google first and self-diagnosing and then trying to go convince the doctor. Right? Okay. And my wife, as a nurse practitioner, faces this all the time. They come in and say, I need a Z-Pack. Well, I haven't even examined you. How do you know that? And she comes home and says to me, they don't have the training to put the pieces together. I've got the training. And I could just see it now. I go into Jennings and I'm saying, you know, I feel terrible, black hole in the morning, and I feel euphoric in the evening, and this up and down, you know, and he says, well, I think you might be manic depressive. No, it can't be that. I did the Google research, you know. And he's like, Steve, I have the training, you know, right? You take his website to any systematician at Evangelical Theological Society, and they will say this is moral influence. In our trade, this is fundamentally moral influence. Sorry. As a professional, it's not identical, but it's the bones of it, moral influence. So whether you deny it or not, as a professional, this is what I see. Okay? So I'm just being honest here. Now, again, it's clear. I just did this slide. Let's move on. Again, even if you go to the seminary, the systematicians and stuff up there, they recognize it. BRI, they recognize it. They all agree. I look at this, it's moral influence. And, yeah, it's slightly varied, slightly tweaked, supercharged, whatever. But a supercharged Ford is not a Maserati, it's still Ford. Okay. Now, my own assessment as I was rereading Tim's website on why he feels he's not the moral influence theory, and he's got all sorts of sub-clicks and so forth, which is why it was taking me till 1 o'clock in the morning the last 2 days, just to make sure I had my facts straight. It's very clear that we have a rejection of the legal elements. And by the way, it's the legal side that we call the objective. When you go to the website, what he calls the objective is still about all what it does for man. So from a professional theological perspective, what he calls objective fits into what we call subjective. So from my perspective, it's still all subjective and no objective. He uses the language of objective, but what he calls objective on his website, it's still about how it affects man, not anything legal or God. And so therefore, by our discipline definitions, it is subjective-only atonement. And I don't think it fair if I entered his discipline for me to capture a term and try to redefine it. Okay? So what I'm saying is in my discipline, what he calls objective, that's subjective, okay? So this is a disciplinary, professional lingo issue. You know, you're free to redefine terms, but I don't think you can redefine disciplines, okay? Maxwell and Jennings are rejecting there's any satisfaction of penalty and there's any legal standing issues with God to be dealt with. It's all on this side. Now, the quotations are quotes from the website. Sin is selfishness, a condition of the heart and mind, which leads to a symptom we call sins. Healing substitution model recognized sin as a terminal condition. So we're in a disease model, and sin is a disease like cancer that kills you. Okay? And just as the cancer patient is not a criminal, well, we can, you followed the... So sin is not a transgression of an enacted law. Quote, the law of love cannot be arbitrary. Agreed. Created. Where did it come from? Enacted or legislated? If the Ten Commandments are a transcript of the loving character of God, that's legislation, folks. But a living out of harmony with natural law, the law of love. In my conversation, he was adamant that moral law and natural law are one and the same. There is no difference. On his website, he seems to be making some nuance that I didn't fully figure out, okay? So I'm going to leave that one. But the point is, natural law is self-enforcing. Key concept. Okay? So the point is, if we're more in a natural law model, there's no going to court, it's this disease, and we're going to cure and heal the disease. Thus, sin is a disease, not a crime. Quote, moving on. If sin is not a legal issue, guess what? Justification. This is a direct quote. This is the heading, followed by justification is not a legal status. Makes sense. If the other one's not legal, how could this be legal, right? Now, this is my summary. It's simply a restoration of a trusting relationship with God. It's setting right the relationship, but there's no legal dimension. He rejects penal model of judgment because that's legal again. Because if you break a law and you're either punished or restored to your legal standing, right? It's a package. So when you reject the legal here, you have to keep rejecting it all the way through. And I would contend that in the Bible even, justification clearly has a legal element. For example, Jesus says that in the judgment before the bar of God, legal context, courtroom idea, by your words you'll be what? Justified or acquitted, right? And by your words you'll be krinomai or apokrinomai, I forget which. Krino is the language of the court, and so is dikaiosune. Okay? And in biblical theology, first of all, justification and righteousness is all one word. They aren't separate concepts, okay? The closest we could say is probably in Paul's idea that God rightefies us, if I could coin a word. Okay? Justification is a nuance that we use in English to nuance a narrower part of the bigger picture of dikaiosune, or tzaddik. Alistair McGrath, in his book on justification by faith, which is now in his little doctrines book, has an excellent discourses that I would recommend to you, but I'll give you the quick version. Justification is related to covenant. And covenant is a legal relationship. And particularly in a sovereignty covenant like the new covenant is, because we're in a war, right? And God is the conquering king in the war against Satan. And to the conquered world, he, like Nebuchadnezzar did to the Jews or whatever, I'm going to offer you a covenant. The conquering king sets all the terms of the covenant. Okay? And your choice is defect and accept the covenant and be pronounced righteous and in right relationship with Nebuchadnezzar, or don't accept the covenant and stay in rebellion and get charged with high treason. Which is, by the way, what Ellen White says the legal charge is against us in the end-time judgment. High treason. That's legal, folks. Ellen White got the court and legal in the charge. And this is why, see, a parity covenant, 2 equals negotiate, right? Susan Tree covenant, the greater sets the conditions that the lesser only accepts or rejects. And this is why we cannot negotiate the gospel, because we're not on parity with God. Okay? And so the point is, when you enter the covenant, you become righteous, tzaddik, dikaiosune, dikaio, whatever, right? And that brings on you now the legal obligations of the covenant. And as long as you maintain the relational, legal relationship of the covenant, you remain righteous. If there's a question, we have the covenant lawsuit. It goes to court. And the prophets are always conducting covenant lawsuits, right? The covenant reeve against Israel. And marriage is called a covenant in the Bible, is it not? And just as in marriage, 2 people stand up in front and somebody makes a pronouncement, and suddenly their legal standing towards each other changes. And we have people today who want to have the marriage without the legality, don't we? And on occasion, we want to have people who want to have the legality without the relationship. Sham marriages, right? Okay. When you say justification is not a legal standing, you're basically saying common law marriage is good enough. Okay. You have to have both to have proper marriage, and you have to have both to have proper justification. That's simple. He then charges, and I'm going to abbreviate because we're way behind schedule here, but basically the penal substitution model, and he blends the two. He builds a bit of a straw man here, and he doesn't do proper differentiation. But he says this is laden with pagan ideology from the Dark Ages, pagan misconception. This is identical to Anselm, except he doesn't apply it to the biblical writers. He puts it to the Middle Ages. Okay? So basically the idea is that if you believe in some kind of courtroom, punishment, held accountable legally, etc., this is not a biblical idea. This is a pagan misconception that was brought into the church, and we are getting rid of this pagan misconception. I want to focus on this part. There's so much more I could say. Penal substitution of Anselm is pretty much replaced, is pretty much rightly represented by him as the offense and the wounded honor and so forth, but the Lutheran side of the Reformation is not. He basically blends paying the law as the same as paying for the wounded honor, and I feel that there are some issues there. The law, folks, is not a matter of rote code, it's a matter of governance and practical issues. All matters of God as governor, king, ruler are removed. I find nothing about this in his website. And when I tried to bring it into conversation, that's this legalistic form. We're in the doctor-patient model, you know. Sin, justice, salvation are all reduced. Notice the title of my slide, Reductionist Tendencies. They're all reduced to a medical model that is entirely one-on-one in relational focus. I have a terminal disease, sin. I need to see the doctor, Jesus, who can remedy my terminal state and realign me with natural law to preserve life. By contrast, justice is a major theme in the Bible. And justice in the Bible has to do with rights and duties that are God-given. And when we deprive people of their God-given rights, that's what we call injustice. And the problem in a sinful world is powerful people are able to deprive people and get away with it. And so at the earthly level, what do we do to remedy the situation? We go to court. And in the Bible, we're going to go to God's court, as we'll see, okay? It's a legal concept, folks, because it can go to court. I can't take natural law to court. Why God holds court on the little horn, right? The little horn tramples the people of God for 1,200 years. And if you're the one that got crushed at year 637, what's your hope? Your hope is the courtroom where God judges in favor of the saints. In the Bible, the thief had to make restitution to the victim with some extra, right? Zacchaeus recognizes this. I stole from people. I'm going to make restitution fourfold with interest. The souls under the altar are crying out, right? How long, O Lord, till you avenge? Ooh. I had a pastor, he's published a book, Very Moral Influence, from California, on a different article I wrote. He says, this desire for vengeance is immature, childish. I've outgrown that. I think I'm jumping a slide, but while I'm on it, I'm going to do it. I emailed him back. I said, in Revelation 19, the heavenly host is praising God that he's bringing judgments down on the whore and that what she did to the God's people is now being done to her by God. Are those heavenly hosts who are unfallen immature? I never got an answer. Jennings deprives justice of the legal rights and dimension, and he reduces it to obedience. Quote, justice means doing what is right, what is complete harmony with God's law of love. There's absolutely nothing about rights and duties. It's just compliance, obedience. And then he says, we restore justice by assisting the victims. So when somebody steals, so Joe Blow steals from my neighbor, I restore justice by giving my helping raise a collection to restore to the neighbor what Joe Blow stole. That's not justice. That's generosity. That's compassion. Because it doesn't deal with Joe Blow. So he has everyone but Joe Blow repairing the problem and the damage, and that's what he calls justice. But there's no solution to the violated right of property ownership, and there's no solution to how do we deal with Joe Blow so he doesn't steal from her again. In my view, these approaches have no mechanism for the corporate injustice issues. It's all one-on-one, you with God in this doctor-patient relationship. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. I specifically, in my 4-hour interview, asked Tim Jennings about the courtroom scenes in Daniel 7 and 8, Revelation, etc., the little horn, etc., and even the destruction of the wicked by fire there at the end of the courtroom scenes in Revelation. I was told that these are all metaphors for the mental anguish that the wicked suffer when they see God's truth revealed at the end of time, and they're so anguished that it kills them. I said, that's fine. Question number 2. If the judgment scene and the fire is metaphor, is the tree of life and streets of gold metaphor? He got upset with me on that one. Folks, if I can't believe what God says about the judgment of the wicked, why should I believe what he says about the new heaven, new earth, and streets of gold? These people talk much about trusting God and restoring trust in God, and yet the model undermines trust, because if I can't believe what he literally says about the judgment scenes and so forth, why should I believe in a new earth? It's a package deal, folks. End-time events all go together. And the destiny of the righteous, if the destiny of the wicked is metaphor, destiny of the righteous has got to be metaphor too. I'm going to argue that this rejection of the legal and penal is not in harmony with the Bible or Ellen White. First of all, this is more of a logical argument. If natural law enforces with natural consequences, then it's not tied to principles of justice. dealing with the God-given rights and so forth. And more so, the natural consequences are self-enforcing, and thus natural law is fundamentally merit-oriented. You obey natural law, it rewards you. You disobey, it punishes you. Because it's very clear in his website and Maxwell's book, Maxwell says, the wages of sin is death, and it is not God who pays that wage. Servant or friends, I forget the page. Okay? Jennings doesn't say it so bluntly, but you can piece it together in his website, okay? And in my conversation. His view of atonement seems to be Christ absorbs the death that would be caused by our separation from God's law of love, and he died that death so that he could restore us to that law, so that we could keep on then in harmony with the law, reap the natural consequences of life. To me, that's the parallel of Butler and Smith, who said, Christ forgives the past and you earn it the rest of the way. Number two, natural law has no grace. You obey, you get the benefits. You disobey, you get the consequences. There is no difference. Push Ellen White and Adolf Hitler off the same cliff and they both splat at the bottom. Natural law doesn't care. Or Jesus and Caiaphas, right? Gravity doesn't care if it's Jesus man or Caiaphas man. You're going down and you're going splat unless there's a miracle, right? But natural law? No. Grace presupposes penal accountability because grace is undeserved. And it's not until you're under condemnation that you're ready for grace. Grace has to be a surprise. When we expect grace, it is no longer grace, it's presumption. And Isaiah 6 is where we feel the condemnation. This is very Lutheran too, right? Until you feel the condemnation of the law, you feel no need of Christ. Very Martin Luther as well as Ellen White. When I was a younger man, you caught the right? I had my learning permit, but I didn't have my license. Understand, we lived so far out in the country that if you went any further back out, you were coming back in. To this day, our town has no police force. It's just covered by state police. We lived on the crest of a 20% grade for about a quarter mile. Now understand that I grew up with very loving but very firm parents who did not suffer fools. You were held accountable, but fairly. And I don't know what got into me. My brother was in college, and my folks went out for the night to some, I don't know, funeral or prayer meeting or something. They were never gone. I was never home alone. I'm home alone. And in the garage on a nail were the keys to the old Ford that I was learning to drive. You can smell what's coming, right? Took the keys, took our pet dog, drove down the hill, down to the swamp, da-da-da-da-da-da. Stepped on the brakes, did a little power burnout, came back up the hill, parked the car by the cabin, walked into the house, and I said, oh, that was fun. By now it's about 9:30 at night, right? And then the fateful words, let me do it once more. Put the dog in the car, started down the hill. Partway down that hill, I stepped on the brakes a little too hard, and the dog went flying down into the footwell, and she's flopping like a fish. So I stepped on the brakes, and just before the car stopped, I leaned down. And when I leaned down, where did the steering wheel go? And I'm fishing the dog out. And what I didn't realize is when I leaned over, it lessened the pressure on the brake in my leg. And the next moment, I hear crunchity bunch. And you know those fence posts with the wires that come to the end and then go down, and there's the dummy post? I somehow missed the dummy post and hooked the passenger wheel on the outside of that sloped wire, and I rode right up the wire and hooked my bumper on top of the post. There was no getting out. And all I could do was grab the dog and walk back up the hill and lay down on my bed and prepare to die. Because my father loved his cars. He washes them once a week, whether they need it or not. I had broken family policy and the Connecticut law, and I deserved whatever was coming. There was no hope. First of all, I thought Dad would see the car was not in the driveway and I would die right then. But he didn't. So I heard him going into their bedroom, so I got up to face the music, told them what happened, and waited for the thunder to clap. And there was a pregnant pause and a quiet, well, let's go get the car. So we hop in his van, we get tow chain, and we go down the hill. Had to cut off the fence post with a chainsaw to drop the car. Finally, we get the car up the hill and in, but the van is now down there with its four-way flashers. And I'm still waiting for the thunder to clap. Feeling miserable. I know I'm wrong. I deserve it. No hope, right? It's case closed. Let's get it over with. And I was walking down the hill at 1:30 in the morning with my father. If that's Dad, I'm trying not to be too far away and look afraid. But I'm trying to be far enough away so that when the thunder claps, there's a little space. We were walking down the hill in silence. And without a word, I suddenly felt a hand on my shoulder pulling me to himself. And boy, did I learn something about my Heavenly Father. Yes, I was disciplined. I had to pay for the damage. I was lucky I could fix most of it myself. Still able to buy my cameras and stuff. Car was fixed. Without a word, the key went back on the nail. But a funny thing happened. When you move from condemnation and no hope into grace, you don't want to go back there. And that key had no attraction, because to get the key was to go back to that ugly place. But if the power of grace wore thin, I knew if I ever took that key and drove unauthorized again, my father would see to it that I never drove again. You can't have grace without law and condemnation. That's simple. Why is it then that the biggest purveyor of grace, the Apostle Paul, has so many arguments about the retribution of God on sin that the higher critics talk about Paul's angry God? It's because he had such a strong view of divine justice that he understood grace. Natural law does not address justice issues. This is why we need an actual judgment with rewards and punishment and justice. Hitler, Stalin, Caesar I was just reading a book about Caesar Augustus, who held orgies almost every night out at his Caesarea palace, bringing in young captive slaves from Egypt and wherever else, forcing them basically to perform pornography for him and to shut them up. They were told if they didn't perform, they would be killed. So they performed, right, to save their lives. And at the end of the night, when it was all said and done, they got thrown off a 500-foot cliff into the sea, so they couldn't talk about it. Hitler, 6 million Jews, and another 1 million or 2 Christians. And natural law did nothing. And can do nothing. Remember the story of Joseph Fritzl? The Austrian who imprisoned his 18-year-old daughter and for 24 years held her in a 600-foot square basement dungeon and fathered 7 children, pardon me. 3 children he kept in the bunker with mom, and 3 he smuggled out as babies under a roof, and his wife had no idea what was going on. He finally gets caught when Elizabeth is 42, after 24 years of literally never seeing the light of day. 3 grandchildren who have never seen the light of day. He was taking one of them to a hospital finally. The 7th baby died in infancy, and he cremated the baby in his own furnace to cover the evidence. Age 75-ish, he gets arrested and convicted and thrown for a life sentence in Austria's prison. Bad heart conditions. He'll be lucky if he makes 10 years in prison. 10 years in prison for 24 years of bondage and rape and so forth? Is that justice? Something's missing here. Natural law cannot solve justice issues. We need a court. Souls under the altar again. How long will you avenge? Christ. Peter says that Christ did not revile on the cross because he entrusted himself not to natural consequences, but to the one who judges justly. Paul, vengeance is mine. He's quoting God here, right? Will repay, not natural consequences. God takes responsibility for it. Are Peter and Paul pagans? Paul, I have a whole list here. We know these well. We all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Georgia court language, again, Romans 14. God will render everyone according to his works with fury and so forth in Romans 2. Leave it to the wrath of God. Vengeance is mine again. Paul tells the Thessalonians that God has seen their suffering and he is going to repay those who afflict you and inflict vengeance on them. To the high priest, when he was smacked, what did he say? God shall strike you, you whitewashed wall. Hope of retributive judgment. I have to ask, was Paul influenced by pagan views of wrath and appeasement? Or was Paul writing under inspiration? Christ, very similar. And again, he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He himself says, I'm coming, my reward is with me, etc. Men of Nineveh will rise up in a final judgment. He sees again the repayment themes. It's all in Christ. Was Christ influenced by pagan? 4th item, related to this, they appeal to the cross as the model of the destruction of the wicked. God didn't torture Christ on the cross. He abandoned him. He's going to abandon the wicked and they'll die naturally. The problem is the New Testament never uses the cross as a model of the end-time judgment and wicked. The cross is a model of self-sacrificial love and substitution. For the end times, they always appeal to the flood, Sodom and Gomorrah. Destructive acts of judicial righteousness. Very interesting. We were going through this. I had Jerry Arnold with me in class one day. I told them I was going to call him out. But I got to give credit where credit is due because I hadn't thought of this. We had a student in class who, God is just going to sit there and weep over the wicked naturally dying. And Jerry brought in the story of Absalom and how David was weeping for Absalom. And Joab came in and he says, you're insulting all the people who have been loyal to you because this guy would have killed you. And we risked our lives for you. And now you sit here and mourn him. You're disrespecting us. And if you don't change, you're not going to have a kingdom by tomorrow morning. If God does not settle justice issues, it will start a new great controversy. Another favorite, God is the one being judged, right? Revelation 14:6, the hour of his judgment, that's God being judged. It's a technical possibility in Greek, but not in the context. Not in the context. The context is you fear the beast because he's going to economically deprive and kill you, or you fear God because he's going to judge you. It's followed by the indictment, Babylon is fallen, and then God's going to pour out his wrath without mixture, and then when the wrath is poured out, the blood flows like a horse's bridle depth. It's God acting as judge. It's his judging of the world in context. The Bible says everyone will give account of himself to God. These guys seem to say God will give account of himself to everyone. If God, not us, gets judged, it undermines accountability to God. And the carnal heart loves to be told that God will not judge them. Loves it. Loves it. Judging God requires a standard higher than God. Because we're judging him by something, right? And what we judge him by becomes higher than God. He's subject to it. And in philosophy, we call this the Euthyphro problem in ethics. Is something good because God said so, which sounds arbitrary? Or did God say so because it's already good? But if it's already good, then there's a standard above God, so why can't we go to the already good and skip God? This is the atheistic argument, right? The answer is both sides are wrong. But I can't get into the full answer of the ethics problem. The point is, you have a standard higher than God by which you judge God. It's one thing to make the personal assessment, do I believe God is consistent with what he's revealed in his principles of righteousness, that I want to be on board or not? But that's not so much a judgment of God as a judgment of my attitude toward God. We don't get to judge if God is God. That's not up for vote. God is God and he has the last word. What I get to judge is how I'm going to relate to him. But I cannot put a standard above God. Place the creature over the creator. If we're accountable to only natural law and God doesn't punish the wicked, why do we have the second resurrection? Because at the brightness of his coming, all the living wicked died of natural consequences. So why are we raising them to die of natural consequences again? No, it's judicial. Joseph Fritzl, if he died and his daughter perished and no one knows she's there, at the resurrection, she gets the healing work of seeing him held accountable and not able to hide from what he did. The problem with this view is that they confuse execution of justice with vindictiveness. And whenever I have wrestled out in the field with people who follow these views, as soon as you start talking about a judgment, oh, God's not arbitrary. Right, he's not arbitrary. He does the judgment with books and evidence that we can understand. He's not vindictive. Right, this is why we have a judgment with books so punishment fits the crime. It's not vindictive, it's professionally done. God puts his personal aside and he goes to the court and he does it in an orderly, objective way, professional way, as a governor, and we cannot fault him of bringing personal bias in. It's not arbitrary, it's not vindictive, it's based on principles. I would argue then that they actually misrepresent God because they reduce him to a partial view, which they call the wider view. Love is divorced from justice and government. It's like saying that a hospital's healing of a gangman's gunshot wound solves his problems, and they don't address the gang dynamics, and they can't address the laws and criminality and damage to innocence and all that stuff that happens outside the hospital. All they can treat is the gunshot wounds one-on-one. No clear doctrine of sinful depravity. This is crucial. Sin is selfishness. We believe Satan's lies. We're saved by believing God's truths. It's almost Gnostic. Get the right knowledge, you're saved. This is not Paul. Paul says that our problem is not bad choices and believing lies. Those are symptoms of the problem. The problem is that we're all rebelling against God, chapters 1 and 2 of Romans, because in chapter 3 he says the Jew and Gentile are all under sin. What's that mean? Sin is an enslaving supernatural power, and you're born under it as a slave. And you cannot deliver yourself. You cannot deliver yourself. And thus it's through faith in Christ and his propitiation that we are transferred from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light, governmental language, legal relationships. And we're all under sin because our ancestors, Adam and Eve, became slaves of sin when they rebelled against God. And they're unable to deliver themselves. And thus in Romans 7, we have the man who sees God's laws, wants to do them, wants to obey them, and what happens? He can't do it because Paul says he's sold under sin. He needs more than a realignment with life-giving principles. He needs deliverance from the slave master. And Jesus is the same. The one who is committing sin is a slave of sin. The slave does not continue, etc. Our problem is not misalignment with the law. Our problem is we're hostage to an evil power. Our problem is not a disease. It's captive to we're in a clash of kingdoms. The great controversy is not over the character of God, it's over the leadership of God. Character is how we attack leadership. That's where the character comes in. Right? Satan didn't want the character of God, he wants the throne of God. Leadership issue. The problem is we're born in the wrong kingdom, and the way Colossians says, we need to be transferred. Delivered from the power of sin. This is what Jesus calls being born again. Otherwise, we end up being like a doctor who goes into ISIS-controlled territory with some kind of neutrality. He provides medical healing to the Yazidi sex slaves, heals their wounds, gives them psychological counseling, whatever else, but then they are left to be raped and pillaged by ISIS. Medical solution didn't solve the whole problem. There's a bigger picture than the medical picture. And the Maxwell Jennings theology reduces it to the doctor-patient picture and then calls it the wider view. God is not arbitrary, but does everything for a reason and with a purpose for all. I agree, but the problem is they seem to assume that everything should be rationally knowable and understandable and that we should have no mystery in our lives. By contrast, Paul says, we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles. God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. Gospel does not make sense to the carnal man, right? I need one more verse here. The unspiritual man does not receive the gifts of the Spirit of God, for they are what? Paul gloried in the foolishness of the gospel. He said, to those who are perishing, it's foolishness. To those of us who are being saved, it's the power of God. Reason can be wrong. And if we're not careful, the come and reason theology becomes the attitude of Thomas. I won't believe until I can make sense of it. And if I do that, I don't obey till it makes sense. Who's the final authority? Me. It becomes an inversion of the trust model they claim to be. I won't trust until I can believe. And to believe without absolute proof over and over again as I go out into the field. And these people hit me. They want evidence, evidence. I can't believe till I have evidence. Some things you got to believe without evidence because you trust the one who revealed it to you. Conclusion, lack of penal judicial element leads to reductionism, which redefines sin, justification, judgment in terms contrary to Scripture. It implies that Jesus, Paul, and Ellen White, and so forth were all under pagan influences and not God, according to his claims in his website. It has no mechanisms for adjudicating matters of justice between perpetrator and victim, and it ignores our real problem, the need of deliverance from the ISIS-like captor called sin. Yes, we need healing, but we need more than that. I already said that. I'm going to move to this one. Very interesting quote. As they reasoned, keyword in Noah's day, they reason today. When the warning message is proclaimed to fear God and keep His commandments, the wrath of God is soon to fall on all the sinful and disobedient, and they will perish in the general conflagration. Professed servants of Christ who are unfaithful, who do not reverence God and with fear prepare for the terrible future event, will lull themselves to carnal security with their fallacious reasoning, as they did in Noah's day. Now, what's the reasoning? Notice the quotes. God is too good and too merciful, they reason, to save just a few who will keep the Sabbath and believe the message of warning. The great men and good men, the philosophers and men of wisdom, would see the Sabbath and shortness of time if it were true. Now she comments, they do not believe a merciful God who made men will consume them with fire because they do not believe the warnings given. This, they reason, is not in accordance with God. Doesn't fit His character. God's love is represented in our day as of being such a character as would forbid His destroying the sinner. Men reason from their own low standard of right and justice. Thou thoughtest that I was altogether such as thyself. They measure God by themselves. I'm reading the whole section for a reason. I want you to know I'm not taking it out of context. They reason as they would act under the circumstances and decide God would do as they imagine they would do. God's goodness and long forbearance, His patience and mercy exercised to His subjects, will not hinder Him from punishing the sinner who refused to be obedient to His requirements. It is not for a man. What's the next two words? A criminal. That's anathema in the doctor healing patient. You're not a criminal, you're diseased. We love to be told that. A criminal against God's holy law, pardoned, legal language, only through the great sacrifice He has made in giving His Son to die for the guilty, because His law was changeless, to dictate to God. So the short sentence, it's not for man to dictate to God. But when she describes what man is, a criminal against God's holy law, whoo! After all this effort on the part of God to preserve the sacred and exalted character of His law, if men through the sophistry of the devil turn the mercy and condescension of God into a curse, they must suffer what? The penalty. Because Christ died, they consider they have liberty to transgress God's holy law that condemns the transgressor and would complain of its strictness and its penalty as severe and unlike God. They are uttering the words of whom? Woo! The word Satan utters to millions to quiet their conscience in rebellion against God. In no kingdom or government, the missing element in moral influence, is it left to the lawbreakers to say what punishment is to be executed against those who have broken the law. All we have, all the bounties of His grace we possess, we owe to God. The aggravating character of sin against such a God cannot be estimated any more than the heavens can be measured with a span. God is a moral what? It's the missing element. As well as a... See, you hear the argument, a father would never kill his children. That's true, but a governor may have to save the city, right? He is the lawgiver. He makes and executes His laws. Jennings says you can't make laws this way. Law that has no penalty is of no force. The plea would be made that a loving father would not see his children suffering the punishment of God by fire while He had the power to relieve them. But God would, for the good of His subjects and for their what? Safety. This is why we have penal courts, to protect the safety of the society from those who endanger it. Romans 13 is a good human example, right? God does not work on the plan of man. He can do infinite justice that man has no right to do before his fellow man. Noah would have displeased God to have drowned one of the scoffers and mockers that harassed him. But God drowned the vast world. Lot would have had no right to inflict punishment on his sons-in-law, but God would do it in strict justice. Now here we're in 12 manuscript release. Last Day Events has the same quote, but it adds one more sentence. Who will say God will not do what he says he will do. And then manuscript 10 takes that sentence and gives us even more. The Lord is coming in flaming fire to take vengeance on those sinners who do not know God. So you can stitch the whole document together here. As they reasoned in Noah's day, so they reason today. You have a very powerful penal element, but even more so you have the governmental element. A loving God having to act as governor to protect the safety of his cosmos. And for that, he uses force in judgment. He does not force us to love him. He does not force us to serve him. But if we do not love and serve him, we become a danger to the universe that has to be dealt with. On the positive side, then, Maxwell and Jennings as polemic is useful in helping victims of heavy legalism, abuse, etc., to see that God is loving, friendly, approachable, and merciful, and this is where it's blessed my life in particular. The danger is that we go from the one ditch of harsh, angry God to the God with no governance at all. It's good at highlighting that God is not hostile to sinners, loving and gracious attributes of God, easy to emphasize, and so forth. So this is how it's blessed me, but the other side is where I have problems. It's denying fundamental biblical truths about justice, God's court, and so forth. And it's that denial that leaves me in problems. But these are the blessings. I want to say two quick follow-ups to the previous talk. Number one, there's a very practical application of the governmental model that brings moral influence and penal together in harmony. And let me illustrate it through parenting. When your child transgresses your law that you made that they can't understand for their good, how do you respond? If you respond emotionally, this leads to vindictiveness and abuse, right? And discipline becomes retaliation. You embarrass me, I'm going to embarrass you. You hurt me, I'm going to get you. And we've all seen families with this dynamic, have we not? The judgment of the wicked and the destruction of the wicked is not God's retaliation or vendetta against the wicked. As a parent, you have to become a governor. And you have to put away that emotional response, I could kill you, right? And you have to go through the discipline and order of an investigative judgment. Son, this is why I'm giving this law. You may not understand it, but I warned you. And now we're going to have to do something about this to help you learn, right? And you're doing it calmly and professionally as a governmental duty. And by modeling that calmness and non-retaliatory and explaining the principles and administering the discipline, your child learns to trust your governance. The super rebellious child may not always trust want to submit to that, but at least they can admit that you were fair and just in what you did. And Satan is going to admit that God is fair and just, but he's never going to agree with it. And so just as God puts the personal aside and works, we have to become professional parent, right? And professional pastor, by the way, too. When your church board blows up in your face, do you blow up back and retaliate? Or do you move into the governmental role and act professional and work through the process and deal with it in an orderly way that models fairness and so forth? Okay? And there's legal accountability. I've had to kick a couple people off of church boards and nominating committees, right? Because they were too dangerous to the process. But I didn't do it. You stupid idiot! Blah, blah, blah. No. The church manual says you're not supposed to be talking about this. The fact that so-and-so can tell me what you said on the nominating committee means you were talking. We can't trust you anymore. you have to be relieved of your duty. Judicial action. Calm, so forth and so on. Okay? Very practical. Very practical. Second point is, I have a self-imposed phobia that it's my profession that nailed Christ to the cross. I should rephrase that. It's our profession. It was the doctors of the law and the clergy, right? When I get a new idea, when I first encountered Dick Gwynn, Graham Maxwell, et cetera, the first thing I do is I try to study and find all the evidence I can in favor of it. Because if I start by trying to find what's wrong with it, I fear that I'll poison myself. And if I see problems or potential problems as I try to find out what I can find in favor, I start making a list to look at later. But I don't want to dwell on what might be a problem. So I want you to understand that everything that I'm presenting you, I have tried to find a way to support it first before I tried to find the problems, to try to prevent me renailing Christ to the cross in a new way. That's my personal approach.